I grew up in the early 2000s, and I played a lot of my favorite games for the first time during that period. Two of these games were Sly 2 and Jak 2. I loved both of these games for a lot of reasons. I loved the characters, the plot, I loved the challenges they each offered, even if I have to still use a glitch to beat one in Jak 2. But something that I've come to appreciate over the years is just how responsive the controls were in both of them. The platforming in Sly 2 is something that I've become so good at over the years that I was able to eagerly take on the time challenges introduced in Sly 3. And as hard as Jak 2 was, I felt as though every time I died was my fault, whether it was due to my impatience or frustration causing me to screw up. But as video gaming progressed and started to look much better graphically, there also became an increase of games that contained more realistic movement. Whether it was for immersion's sake or to make the premiere of future games look ahead of their time, this was an inevitable thing that would become a part of most major genres of gaming. I've always felt a bitterness whenever I thought about super fluid, realistic-looking animation in games. There are games that implement it pretty well. All of the Arkham games managed to have pretty tight controls while also having the characters move pretty fluidly, and the Souls games sort of turned this movement into a mechanic with all of the different weapons you can wield. But there are other games for which I feel having this fluidity hurts the game's potential. GTA 5 was an alright game, but the gunfights were so slow-paced due to how slow the characters move when doing pretty much anything. But I think the best example of how fluid movement could ruin a game was in Assassin's Creed 2. Assassin's Creed 2 had some of the most sluggish-feeling platforming and combat I've ever played. The platforming feeling as automatic as it does made it extra frustrating whenever a mistake is made. And the combat feels like it's only designed for the good-looking kill animations and not designed to be a proper combat system. Overall, I feel that if this game didn't have the need to feature realistically moving characters, it could have been a fun game. But now this game is the sole reason I get nervous whenever I see a game presented with super fluid animation. With that in mind, I gave The Last Guardian a try, and not only was this game shown off at E3 with super realistically moving characters, it was shown off over the span of a 7-year development cycle, so that's 2 red flags already. But nevertheless, I gave it a try. And it was interesting at first, and Trico was a very fascinating sort of creature just based on how his AI behaves. But The Last Guardian came with a plethora of problems. The minimalistic storytelling elements of the game made it feel without pacing. The environments are so confined yet also really hard to navigate. The AI of Trico just made every puzzle a test of patience, and the slow movement of the main character as he struggled to climb anything tested my patience even further, to the point where I decided it wasn't worth completing this game. I ended up feeling very disappointed when this game did not turn out to be good, but I also kept having another thought, and that thought was, Shadow of the Colossus has to be good compared to this. So one day I saw it in a used game store. I decided to buy it, then I played it, I had a very interesting experience, and now it's the next game I'm going to review. Does this game hold up today? Does it contain issues that are reflective of the problems in The Last Guardian? Does the method in which you control the main character hamper the experience? Is it engaging despite its minimalistic method of storytelling? Well, let's find out. First, I want to quickly talk about the opening cutscene that plays whenever you start the game. It's amazing. The way it sets the tone for the beginning of the game is awesome. The way it depicts the main character going on a long journey and the music that accompanies said journey creates an opening I watched every time I started up the game. But right now, let's talk about the main story. Some of you may already know about the vagueness of this game's story. All we know from the start is that a boy named Wander makes a long journey to the seemingly empty land in order to resurrect a girl named Mano. He arrives at a shrine and makes a deal with Dorman, the mysterious entity that lives there. Dorman tells Wander that if he is able to kill all 16 Colossi that live in this land using his Sword of Light, he can perform a ritual that will resurrect the girl. He then sets off to find and kill each of the Colossi, with very few cutscenes and dialogue in between. In fact, the only reason I know the names of Wander and Mano is due to a combination of TV tropes and the end credits listing their voice actors. And also, supposedly at one point, Wander says Mono's name, but I guess in the quietest voice possible since I never heard it. Anyway, a lot of it is left to interpretation, and thankfully there is a lot to interpret. Whether it's the destroyed ruins, the barrenness of this massive world, or the way the Colossi behave, I found the story aspect of this game to be fun because of that. With that in mind, I'd like to talk about what I think is one of the most interesting aspects of the story, since without it, I don't think I would have been as emotionally invested in the story. When Wander asks Dorman to resurrect Mono, he obviously displays great care for her, just based on the fact that he's willing to make this deal in the first place, and the fact that he believes her death was wrong in the first place. He's clearly determined to save her, but something happens at the end of the first boss fight that caught my attention. Once I killed the first Colossus, these black ribbon-like things came out of the Colossus and were absorbed into Wander. Wander then wakes up in the shrine, and then he says nothing about this. He doesn't ask what this means for the ritual, or whether or not it's even supposed to happen. He just sits there and listens as Dorman tells him about the next Colossus. This routine continued for about 5 more Colossi, and then I came to my own conclusion. Despite being determined to save the woman he cares about, he seems to have this passiveness about him. Like he's determined to save Mono, but he also doesn't seem to mind what happens to himself in the process. Wander absorbing the ribbon seems to have a physical effect on him that becomes more apparent as you kill more Colossi. And though it's ambiguous as to how that affects him, he never at one point feels the need to question what's going on with him. Also, resurrection is not exactly an easy thing to pull off in any fictional universe. So Wander has no reason to believe this will work. But I guess he doesn't care either way, as it might be all he has left. The best comparison for what I'm trying to explain would be James Sunderland's character in Silent Hill 2. In Silent Hill 2, James goes on a search for his missing wife, but he doesn't really care that the search is dangerous, even when he's explicitly told that Silent Hill is an ominously dangerous town.
Is it dangerous?
Maybe. And it's not just the fog, either.
Okay, I got it. I'll be careful.
I'm not lying.
No, I believe you. It's just... I guess I really don't care if it's dangerous or not. I'm going to town either way.
I think both are characters that pursue a goal not because they wish to obtain that goal, but because for them, it's all they have left. And because of this fact, I was able to become engaged in Wander's journey. While there's one more dark horse I've yet to talk about, I'd rather talk about her in a later part where I'd think it'd be more appropriate. But for now, I'll say that I really ended up enjoying this minimalistic approach to storytelling. I really enjoyed being able to give my interpretation on the main character, as well as the other various elements of the game. Actually, now that I think about it, it's kind of weird to say that I enjoyed the story. Most of the games I reviewed up to this point had their story told through extensive dialogue and cutscenes. And that's not to say that I'm not familiar with games that use a unique method of storytelling, I'll tell you that much. But I guess it's just weird saying that a story told in this manner was enjoyable. But now it's time to stop talking about the story. It's time to talk about playing Shadows of the Colossus, starting with how you navigate the world. Since I've mentioned it before, I'll start with the fact that the Sword of Light is not an ordinary sword. It is in fact one of the main tools for navigating this world. You can hold a face button in order to hold up the sword so that you can find each Colossus, and as long as you're in sunlight, lights will reflect off your sword and point the way. But this world is impressively massive, with several different types of environments, and the only way to navigate it quickly is using Wander's horse that he calls Aggro. Initially, I hated this horse. The controls for getting on and off the horse are ridiculous. You have to hit the jump button while on the left side of the horse to get on, but the positioning is so specific that you're more likely to jump in place if you're in a more vital situation. By complete accident, I figured out later that you can use the grab button to grab onto Aggro from both sides to bypass the specificity of the main method, but it's still not something that I was able to reflexively pull off. Other than simply getting on Aggro, there are several moments where she will steal control over you, mainly when you gallop by the cliffs. Sometimes Aggro will automatically avoid cliffs, and other times she will just stop, causing you to have to turn her around to get her going again. And by the way, Aggro takes the longest time to speed up and slow down compared to any other horse I've ridden in video games, and that just adds to the frustration. Much like Trico from The Last Guardian, there are moments where I feel like I'm fighting Aggro more than working with her. But as the game progressed, something really odd happened. I slowly began to have less problems controlling aggro, especially as she became essential to boss fights. Actually, a lot of the problems I mentioned earlier were still there towards the end of the game, but I guess I slowly grew to accept those little quirks. I guess what I'm trying to say is that despite all of her issues, I eventually grew attached to my horse. I got attached to the point where I really got frustrated when I learned there was a pet command, since I learned it way after I completed the game. I can't say for sure if anyone else will get attached to aggro like I did, but I'd wager that a lot of people definitely could with what's here, and that attachment is a nice little bonus as you navigate the world in search of this game's boss fights. All 16 Colossi come with their own unique method to defeat them, but all of them have at least one weak point represented by a sigil that Wander can find using his Sword of Light. In order to get at the weak points, you have to find a way to climb onto the Colossus so that Wander can get to it. The strategy for latching onto the Colossus varies from boss to boss. Sometimes it's as simple as latching onto a body part from the ground and beginning the climb, but most of the time boarding the Colossus requires a bit more strategy. Sometimes you have to find a way to force a Colossus to a climbable state by damaging it from afar. Other times you will have to lure it into some sort of trap, and sometimes even just getting to the Colossus is part of the boss fight. So it's a good thing that Wander has a decent set of tools that you can use to fight these different Colossi. I've already talked about the sword and its uses, but he also has a bow that can be used to attack Colossi from afar, or to simply get their attention, as some boss fights don't even bother with you until you shoot at them. Aggro is also vital for the boss fights that move faster than Wander on foot, and you can even shoot arrows while riding aggro from either a sitting or a standing position. Once you find a way to latch onto a Colossus, the climbing part of that boss fight begins. Climbing anything in the game requires you to hold down the R1 button to grip, move by using the left analog stick, and occasionally jump to a different grip point. However, you will only hang on as long as you have stamina, which is represented by a slowly shrinking circle. Whenever you're hanging on to anything, Wander's stamina meter will begin to decrease. The only way to gain it back while climbing a Colossus is to find level ground to stand on. Additionally, you can hold the R1 on level ground to brace Wander, since the Colossi often try to prevent your journey to their weak point by shaking about in various ways. The climb to the weak point is sometimes just a simple climb, where you will head straight to it while maybe having to rest a couple of times. But other times it gets a bit more complex, like when you have to jump between climbable points, or if you have to do some additional work in order to reveal a new path to a weak point. Once you get to a Colossus's weak point, the final struggle often begins. In order to stab a Colossus, you have to hit a button to raise the sword, and hit the same button to bring it down. You will do more damage the more Wander extends his arms, and once you reach the max damage output, Wander will make what can only be described as a power-up noise. But Wander often has a limited amount of time to make these strikes due to the Colossi resisting in some way. Having the ability to judge as to when to go all out or play it safe with the sword strikes is often the key to finishing any Colossi within a reasonable amount of time. The sheer variety of Colossi and the fact that they all have different strategies causes the difficulty curve to move very wildly throughout the game. One boss may take you so long that Dorman will have given you the same hint multiple times, and then the next boss will take you about 5 minutes because the solution will be obvious to you. What also factors into this difficulty curve is how the different Colossi attack you. More specifically, I find that whenever a Colossus uses projectiles, it's always difficult to initially determine how powerful it is, and what it even does when it hits. Though this is not really a huge problem overall, as I find that the different solutions really help make each boss stand out, no matter how difficult it was. In addition, I like that most of the hints that Dorman gave me usually prevented me from looking up a guide, as most of them sit in a nice spot between vague and specific, so as to be informative without being condescending. While I definitely enjoyed certain bosses over others, there was only really one Colossus I hated, and that's Colossus number 15. Without spoiling anything, I'd heavily advise anyone to just watch a video of someone beating this boss so that you don't have to go through what I went through. And I say that because number 15 has the most obscure bunch of steps you have to take in order to beat it. And this is really the only boss fight where I remember Dorman's advice feeling the most condescending, as the advice may as well have told me to get good. But most of the bosses are designed well, and the one thing that really held it all together were the controls. Wander is a character that moves, tumbles, and falls realistically, and it adds to the experience without taking away any of it. While timing dodges and movements are part of the boss fights, they are not reliant on the instantaneous reaction time that would be expected of games like Dark Souls or Devil May Cry. You can't dodge roll or jump in a direction without Wander taking a split second to face that direction. And in order to hit a target with Wander's arrows, you'll need to wait for him to draw the arrow. But all of that movement is clearly designed for fighting this game's bosses, and because of that, the fights are paced pretty well. I rarely felt that it was a slog doing anything with my character, unlike The Last Guardian. Though I will say that it does slow down a bit during the final part of some boss fights, mainly the parts when you're trying to stab a weak point and the Colossus tries to shake you off. There are moments where it feels like the Colossus is shaking about for way too long and also way too frequently, leaving little room for stabbing. I learned that I can get some bosses in a pattern by stabbing it at a certain rate, but my ability to do this didn't exist until I was halfway through, and until I got to that point, many boss fights really slowed down at that point. But despite all that, none of the boss fights slowed down to the point where it became a complete slog. Overall, these fights are great. In a game where the only enemies you fight are bosses, is one that could completely fail for various reasons. It could fail because most of the bosses are uninteresting. It could fail because the combat feels boring. It could fail if the controls designed for the fights don't feel right. But none of these things happened, and I left the game with some very memorable and positive boss experiences. And as much as I would like to end it with that, I should first talk about the game's presentation. A lot of this game's presentation definitely holds up today. The world is very detailed with many different types of environments to explore and fight Colossi in. You can also definitely get the impression that this is a ruined and forbidden land by just traveling through it. Wander, Aggro, and Mono are all designed and animated well, and the same go for the Colossi themselves. Not only are they very cool looking, but the way that they are animated definitely conveys the feeling that these creatures are massive, and Wander's animations in comparison definitely help sell that feeling. But the main thing I want to address in this section of the review is something many of you might have already noticed, and that is the fact that this game runs at a very low frame rate. It clearly doesn't run at a full 60 frames per second, but it runs below a more common 30 frames per second. And I can tell you right away that the frame rate just makes this game feel old as soon as you notice it. This is something that I feel would prevent most people from even going past the start screen nowadays. But I ended up actually making peace with this frame rate in a way. As much as I rather all my games run at 30 or 60, I feel the low frame rate of this game helps in that it makes the Colossi you fight feel massive. Whenever the Colossi step near you or try to smash you, it causes the ground to shake, and this effect combined with the frame rate sort of feels like what would happen to a person if they experienced such seismic activity. Does that make sense? Like, if the ground next to him suddenly started shaking, wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that Wander's senses might need to recover from that? Well, anyway, that's my positive outlook on the frame rate situation. But even if it bothers you, the game still has one of the best looking open worlds I have ever seen. The sound part of the presentation is also done pretty well. I specifically want to highlight how much the sound design contributed in the boss fights, as it does an excellent job of projecting the size and power of these Colossi, with every giant step they take and everything they smash or shoot. I especially like the sound effect that occurs whenever you stab a Colossus in its weak point. It just sounds so powerful and real. The music is also great. I have already talked about how great the opening theme is, and in addition to that, the rest of the soundtrack does a really good job of conveying the tone of this game, as well as being a playlist for great boss battle music. So that's it for Shadows of the Colossus. Many of you might have heard the praise that this game has gotten in the past, and I'd say it deserves it. The story is great because while it's vague, it gives you just enough information to allow you to interpret it in whatever way you feel is right. Besides that, the game excels at being a boss fight focused game where you fight against giant colossi. Many of the boss fights from this game are just going to stick with me just because of how incredible they were. There are just so many moments I can still remember from when I played the game. But the boss fights would have been nothing special if not for the controls that were simply made for fighting these bosses. Everything about the way the main character moves is right for this game, And after my experience with The Last Guardian, I feel very satisfied that I can say that. If you ever see the PS2 version on the shelf of a used game store, it's definitely worth the pickup. But if the new HD remaster coming out turns out to be good, you might want to get that instead. That's all I have to say, and thank you for watching.